Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight on this Thursday, September 5th.
There is political will to stop displacement around the Obama Center.
Rent rises near the Obama Center. A look at the school year ahead with Chicago Public Schools CEO Janice Jackson. Paying a toll to drive into downtown Chicago? What congestion pricing could look like in the city. What one city is doing to ban the legal sale of marijuana come next year.
You think of the city as the museum and the neighborhoods as the galleries.
How a public art initiative is bringing attention to Chicago neighborhoods with an interpretation of the city's founders. How much do service members and civilians interact? Some say not enough. But a new podcast out of the University of Chicago aims to change that.
The breadth of what we see is amazing.
And the art of art conservation, including how to rejuvenate an 18th century Chinese treasure. All that and more next on Chicago Tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brandis Friedman. Here's some of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Former Illinois First Lady Patty Blagojevich is reacting to word that federal prosecutors have dropped corruption charges against former Congressman Aaron Schock. She tweeted, quote, "Wire fraud, mail fraud, falsifying documents, theft of government money, tax evasion, 0 days in jail." She compares that to the 14-year sentence given to her husband, former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. Patty Blagojevich goes on to ask, where is the outrage? In that deal, Schock agreed to repay his campaign committees and work with the IRS to determine how much he owed in taxes. A new study shows thousands of Chicago public schools homeless students are not only concentrated in 10 of the city's wards, but many are also not eligible for federal aid. The report from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless says of the 16,000 homeless CPS students, the majority are in the 20th, 24th, and 28th wards. But because 90% of them live in temporary housing that's shared with other families, they aren't recognized as homeless by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
But it's not just about stable home, it's also about having a support system. I feel that the reason why other students, including I, lack the motivation to want to go to high school or pursue college is because we don't have the financial or academically or emotionally support.
And the young man you just heard from is in stable housing now and a college senior. He and advocates, along with several aldermen, are calling on the city to pass a real estate transfer tax in order to provide a funding stream for housing services. And Starbucks fans, mark your calendars. The long-awaited Starbucks Reserve Roastery has an opening date, and it is, drum roll please, November 15th at 10 a.m. The massive 4-story, 43,000 square foot space, replacing what was a crate and barrel on the Mag Mile, will be the biggest of its kind. It'll offer on-site roasting of its rare reserve beans, as well as tours, cocktails, desserts, pizzas, salads. Never too late for coffee. As for the weather, cloudy tonight with a low around 63, then showers and storms early tomorrow morning. Otherwise, mostly cloudy with a high near 75. President Barack Obama's planned Obama Center is still years from opening. There hasn't even been an official groundbreaking yet, but a new report suggests it may already be having an effect on the surrounding neighborhoods. Chicago Tonight's Amanda Vinicky is here with more. Amanda, what does this report show?
Well, Brandis, it shows in short that in those surrounding areas, housing costs are rising, and that could give credence to those who have feared ever since Obama announced that he had chosen Jackson Park to host his center, that it would lead to residents getting pushed out.
This report is just gravy on the potatoes. This is our lived experience. We already know that the displacement has happened.
The report broadly looked at communities within a 2-mile radius of the Obama Center, including Greater Grand Crossing, Hyde Park, South Shore, Washington Park, and Woodlawn. It showed that many of the area's current renters have incomes under $20,000 and are already spending too high a percentage of that income on rent. Also, that eviction rates are among the highest in Chicago. In South Shore, evictions average $1,800 a year. As for homeowners, most have annual income of $75,000. UIC urban planning professor Janet Smith says they're fine in that regard, but there is still a concern.
But what we're concerned about is, while many of them can afford their housing now, what we found in the data is that housing prices are going up, and maybe at a faster rate, it looks like in the last few years, than the city of Chicago. So I may want to live in that neighborhood and stay in that neighborhood, but if my housing value goes up, that means my taxes go up, and can they stay?
And so, Amanda, we know that generally we know what the data says. Now what?
Well, Alderman Taylor represents the area, and in July she sponsored an ordinance in the city council that seeks to guarantee her constituents won't be displaced.
Because this is about the people who actually live there being able to stay. That's what this is about to us. We keep trying to make it like that this is just protecting low-income and working families. This is everybody who currently lives in this community being able to stay and enjoy the OPC.
That housing ordinance would require 30% of all new housing in the 2-mile area surrounding the Obama Center be dedicated to affordable housing. Alderwoman Taylor says that leaves plenty for housing developers to profit from.
Just think about this. We're only asking for 30%. 70% will still be market rent. Do we know what market rent is? We got a home in Woodline that's selling for $700,000. Nobody could afford that right now. The median income is $24,000. So tell me what is morally right?
But real estate developer Gian Foreman says developers have no choice but to consider, will they want to invest in an area with a 30% requirement or somewhere else where it's 10%? He says the South Side doesn't need to put up any additional barriers to development.
What we don't want to do is, while we have momentum on our side, put something in place that artificially makes it more difficult to bring the needed investment that we want in the community, because housing is one part of the ecosystem, right? There are jobs that go along with it. There's commercial corridor investments that go along with it, the improvements in school and safety. And so I think we have to really look at it all as an ecosystem.
Foreman says, yes, people will be displaced, but not just because of the Obama Center. He says people, like his grandmother, had worked for years and years to get to the point where their investments in the community paid off, and that is an opportunity.
At a time when we're losing black population, let's set a goal. How do we attract black families to this community? How do we make sure that home ownership is an important part of what happens in this community? How do we take advantage of the visitors that are going to come to this community so we can start new businesses and grow those businesses, and not just think about providing housing for low-income families, but let's think about mobility. Let's think about how do we move those families from needing low-income housing to being able to someone who actually can create the community that they want to create. So I'm excited.
So Amanda, then what is the future of the Obama Center housing ordinance?
Well, Alderwoman Taylor says she's hoping to pass that ordinance next month. Backers are, though, looking for support from Mayor Lori Lightfoot, and that may prove crucial. They don't have it. In a statement, her office says Lightfoot is committed to ensuring all voices are heard. She is hosting community forums and working on a framework to address gentrification concerns, but no endorsement of that ordinance. No endorsement either from the Obama Foundation, which in a statement said that the foundation appreciates community organizers' work, and we want neighbors who've called this community home for decades to remain on the South Side as long as they wish.
Amanda, thank you. And up next, we sit down with the head of Chicago Public Schools.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Allstate. Allstate is investing in Chicago's youth. We believe good starts young. That's why we're helping our youth develop the skills they need to achieve success in life. Allstate is proud to empower the next generation of leaders.
The Chicago Teachers Union has set a strike authorization vote for the last week of September, meaning a teacher strike could come as soon as October 7th. It is the latest turn in what's been a contentious round of contract negotiations, but it's far from the only issue facing Chicago public schools. Graduation gains, enrollment losses, the perennial budget crunch, and keeping students safe and schools accessible. Those are just some of what's on the plate for Chicago Public Schools CEO Janice Jackson, who joins us now to talk about the upcoming school year. Janice, welcome back to Chicago Tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So, as I just mentioned, CTU has set a date for their strike authorization vote later on this month. What is your reaction to that move?
Well, a couple of things. First, this is something that we anticipated. Statutorily, it's a process, and we knew that this was, a next logical step in these negotiations. What I want parents to know is that we've been meeting now 3 times a week with the union, and I'm fairly confident, very confident, I should say, that we will reach a deal. We had a neutral fact finder put out his proposal, which came very close to our initial proposal. CPS accepted that, which gets us very close to the gets us close to the compensation. I think the things that matter the most, the things that fall within the purview of the CTU that we can bargain over, we have good alignment. And so I see no reason why schools should be interrupted when we have made so many so many gains through the negotiation and fact-finding process.
Do you think the public and parents will support CTU if they should walk out the way they did in 2012?
I can't, that's not for me to answer. What I do know is that most of our teachers, as well as our administrators, are happy and feeling excited. I think it's a very different climate now. You talked about some of the challenges that we face. There are things that happen annually, but CPS is in a very different place now. So I think that people want to see their children in school. I think people know that we've put a fulsome offer on the table and fully expect teachers to accept that. Some of the other issues that they brought up with regard to staffing fall outside of our bargaining purview, but they're also important to us, which is why we budgeted them in our budget, which was just approved last week by the Board of Education, and have every intention to make good on the promises that we've made with regard to staffing.
And I want to come back to some of that staffing a little bit later on, but I know that you guys were back at the bargaining table today. What are you hearing from the team about the current status of negotiations?
Well, people are much more encouraged. I mean, things have definitely heated up in the last couple of days with schools starting back, but I count that as a good sign. I mean, we're really serious about coming to a resolution. I think our partners at CTU are equally serious, and it really is about figuring out what is it going to take to land the plane and come up with a contract. I've been in this position before, and I know that compensation was always a huge issue. And one thing that, it took us a while to agree on because of the financial situation of the city and the district. We're not in that position today, and we've made an offer that I think most teachers, looking at their paycheck, looking at the fact that over the course of the next 5 years, they're going to see upwards of a $20,000 pay increase. People feel good about that, knowing that a recession might be looming. So I think that is probably the most important factor, but also seeing that in my administration and in Mayor Lightfoot's administration, you have 2 like-minded people who also agree that the wraparound services and some of the other things that they've brought to the table are equally important.
So you just heard, we've reported that so many CPS students are concentrated, homeless students especially, are concentrated in the same 10 wards on the south and west sides. What was your reaction to that, and what can and what does CPS do to support those students?
Well, first, I want to thank the advocates for lifting that up. I saw the young man in the piece, and I think he's doing a really good job representing that. CPS already recognizes students who live in temporary housing situations as homeless students and students that need support. And so I think that putting pressure on the federal government to move to that in that direction, I think makes a lot of sense. We also provide transportation as well as working to reduce barriers around paperwork and things like that that homeless students may need for registering for school. So I think CPS is ahead in many regards for support for our students in temporary living situations. But with that said, we continue to work closely with the advocates because there is still room for improvement.
Now, some of the staff members within schools who might work with homeless students might be social workers, nurses, and CPS is just the budget that you all passed just recently. You say it's a down payment on the plan to hire 250 nurses, 200 social workers over the next 5 years. Is that enough?
Well, I think it's enough. Well, I won't say enough. I think it's a really great start. There are a few things that people have to take into consideration, and we've had these conversations. First, 95 additional positions have already been budgeted for this year. We want to see a social worker in every school the same way the union wants to see a social worker in every school. The fact of the matter is the talent pool is not there. And so it would be easy to make promises that we simply can't keep. But if you look at the number of people who are completing programs, for example, school nurse programs or social work programs to work in our schools, the numbers just aren't there. So what we've done as a district is we are being creative, recruiting individuals who have social work degrees to go back and get their school license, and doing the same with nurses. We need CTU to be partners with us around the talent issue. What gives me a lot of confidence today is that finances are not the barrier. I've been at the table where finances were a big part of the conversation, and we're in a much stronger position fiscally. So now it's really about a meeting of the minds.
There's a bit of a trust issue with CTU, and they've repeatedly said they don't trust politicians, no matter who the mayor is, to keep their promises. How do you win that trust, and how do you they don't believe that this is actually going to happen by budget, not by contract?
Trust is important, and we know that trust is discerned through interactions, and people have to make promises and make good on that. What I would say, though, is that if you look at the rules of engagement around bargaining, we are within those rules. Some of the issues that have been raised, we share the same concerns, and we're ready to make good on the resources that are needed in order to mitigate some of those concerns in our schools. But we also have to we can't change the rules around labor negotiations because the city and the district have decided to pay the compensation that the union was asking for. And so that's one of the things that I've been trying to message to our stakeholders, parents, teachers, et cetera. We knew going into this where some of the sticking points were around compensation and health care. I feel like we have been very open in listening to the demands of the union in order to make sure that we're treating our educators appropriately, because they do great work on behalf of kids. But I also believe we can't change the rules because we think that we're going to throw everything into this contract. It simply doesn't work like that.
So in addition to the pay raise that you just referenced, the district is also offering to phase out the private contracts for nurses, counselors, therapists, et cetera. Maintaining that those positions are tough to hire for those. So if you're not privatizing, what is the district doing then to make it an attractive place for these folks to work?
Well, the first thing I would say is that CPS does have a lot of advantages in attracting talent, which is something that's great. We live in a large city with a lot of amenities. I think the biggest
But you'll hear about the difficult working conditions from a lot of people that currently work.
But if you look at the number of graduates, it really is a pipeline issue. The number of graduates coming out of schools here in Illinois and the surrounding states, majority of those people end up working in CPS. The problem is we don't have enough of those people choosing this as a profession initially. And so many of our efforts have been around how do we get registered nurses, for example, to go back and get their school license so that they can work in schools. The same with social workers. So we don't have as much of a talent deficit in that area, but people have to get a certification in order to work in our schools, and that presents a challenge. So the district has paid for people to go back and get their endorsements and master's degrees, and we intend to continue to do that.
So we've been in school for 3 days. One of the persistent problems for CPS is declining enrollment over the years. What are you expecting for this school year?
Yeah, well, we've been very transparent about our enrollment challenges, and last year, you may recall, we embarked on probably an unprecedented community engagement process to talk about the data. A few things still stand out. We know that there's been a large demographic and population shift, in particular on the south and west sides of Chicago. We also know that birth rates are down dramatically, and so as a system, as a city, the changing demographics is something that we have to continue to pay attention to. And CPS, I think, has done a really good job with our annual regional analysis, putting that data out there so that we can work community by community to come up with solutions around schooling and other programming opportunities that need to be present for the residents who choose to stay there.
In recent weeks, you've announced that CPS's graduation rate has gone from nearly 57% in 2011 to nearly 80% now, a record high, but that's also a very big jump in 8 years. How's that possible?
Well, it's possible because of slow, sustained sustained progress. And if you look at the rates over time, the first thing that I would attribute that to is the use of data in our district. We started prioritizing freshman year with our students, drawing off the research from the University of Chicago's Consortium on School Research, which showed us that if students stay in school longer and if they successfully complete 9th grade, they're 3 times more likely to complete 12th grade in 4 years. We organized our high schools around that. We saw the FOT, the freshman on track rate, go up, and it had a correlation with our graduation rate. So I think slow, sustained progress over time has really helped CPS catch up with the rest of the nation and, in fact, drive the national graduation rate.
You also announced a record $1.4 billion scholarship offerings for CPS students. What's the district doing to encourage sort of that college-going, scholarship-getting culture?
Yeah, well, the reason this is a metric that is so near and dear to my heart is because it shows that there's a huge investment in our students. These dollars come from universities mostly and other philanthropic partners, but I think when universities say, not only do we want you, you are a CPS student, we're going to help fund and pay for your education, it speaks volumes. It also reinforces what we already know about the positive academic trends. We have students of need, but that are also making the gains and making the grade. And as a result, they secured this year $1.5 billion. So we're really excited about that metric.
Janice Jackson, Chicago Public Schools CEO, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And there's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so please stay with us.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, marijuana sales for recreational use will be legal in Illinois come January, but not all cities in the state are on board. A museum you can see from the comfort of Chicago's Green Line, the floating museum's new transit assembly installation. Bridging the gap between the military and civilians, that's the focus of a new podcast out of the University of Chicago. And restoring artwork and treasures from Imperial China at a Chicago conservation lab. But first, in her State of the City address last week, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot said she wants to reduce traffic congestion in the city and raise money from doing so.
We are exploring options to address rampant congestion that solves the problem of traffic, pollution, and other issues while simultaneously bringing in a fair share of funding.
Some transit advocates hope that could mean a new fee on drivers in certain parts of the city known as congestion pricing. Joining us to talk more about how that could work in Chicago is Joseph Sweeterman, director of DePaul University's Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development. Welcome back to Chicago Tonight, Joe.
Thank you.
So, an overview, please. What exactly is congestion pricing?
Well, it's a hot concept in transportation. We all know that drivers jump behind the wheel. They don't take into account the social costs, the congestion that they may cause others. And there are certain areas where it's reaching real quality of life consequences. And I think downtowns of major cities are where that's happening. So we see London and Singapore have pioneered the concept that drivers pay to enter a certain cordon zone, and New York is getting ready to do the same.
How's it working out in those cities?
Well, it seems to be pretty effective. In London, the fee is pretty high. It's £11. Other cities do it quite low. New York is going to consider something really interesting, using automated license plate readers for cars that go below 60th Street on Manhattan. And the fees will be varied. There's exemptions for people that live in the zone, for low-income people. And it's really just in the last year or two that these automated license plate readers are getting so effective that you can contemplate these kind of things.
So if Mayor Lightfoot and the City Council were to implement something like this in Chicago, what might it look like?
Well, Chicago, I think we got to recognize first that we're not London. We're a great global city, but we have a grid that moves pretty well. So traffic is really bad in some areas, but it's not universally bad downtown. So I think when the city looks at this, hires a consultant, they'll probably see there's certain choke points. You look at the Magnificent Mile, you look at the river area, you look at River North, And we have a building boom downtown. And so things are just going to get worse. So I think the exciting part of this is you could come up with a kind of a nuanced fee that's not prohibitive to come downtown, but it makes people take into account whether their trip is worth the congestion.
So certain choke points, but also times of day when it's worse.
No question. And you think about summer evening rush, that's sort of the absolute worst. And even a small behavioral incentive, if you think of a $1.50 fee to enter a certain part of downtown, don't automatically, your iPass could be used. There's also the idea you could maybe have people do this on apps, so you wouldn't have to have quite so much public information about where everybody is at any one given point. And so the research shows that people really respond to price incentives, but you got to find the right balance. If this looks like sort of a big revenue grab by the city, there's going to be a lot of pushback.
What are some of the benefits of using this kind of method?
I think the best part, you look at this, we're kind of out of options for the city to deal with congestion. And let's face it, traffic is rising again, fuel prices are up. People have barely noticed Governor Pritzker's tax increase because fuel prices came down. And car ownership is up again. Transit ridership's flattened out, and here we have a building boom downtown, and something's going to have to give. Fatalities are up. So it has a lot of benefits that just put an incentive in people's mind to think twice about that rush hour trip.
What are some of the problems you could run into, though?
Well, it's no question that you could overstep. You could set the fee too high. You think about the reason striking this balance is so difficult is we want people to come downtown. It's the engine of our city. We want to maintain this great global loop that's on fire economically right now, and we don't want to encourage people to stay in the suburbs. And so the fee has to be scaled to achieve its effect without putting up roadblocks for commerce.
So there's no specific plan from the city just yet. This has just been floated, but what could a range of fees look like if this were to be implemented?
Yeah, and I think the first question is going to be equity, that there's a lot of individuals low income. We have a lot of people living downtown. You can't broadside them with a fee. So I think the city will probably start smart. And I think as the technology evolves, the cost of collecting those fees goes down. These readers are now astoundingly efficient, but it's expensive to mail people a bill, so we'd like to find ways to do that. So we'll have a discussion about that. I would say, you know, fees in a couple dollar range might be something the public could swallow and bring in some revenue for the city at the same time.
Could this realistically make a dent or get close or just a piece of the puzzle for that $1 billion deficit or nearly $1 billion?
Yeah, it's hard to tell worldwide how successful these are, but the evidence overall is pretty favorable. And you look at London, traffic hasn't gotten worse. And that's saying something for a European city that's had a lot of population growth and so forth. You look at Singapore, and they've found a way to do it while protecting the poor. So an individual who works the night shift at a hotel and he needs to drive, he probably can get an exemption. New York is thinking of incomes less than 40 or 60,000. If you live in the zone, you don't pay the fee, but that could turn into a circus of everybody trying to get an exemption. So that balance is really important.
Chicago already has a flat fee on rideshare trips with companies like Uber and Lyft. So how might congestion pricing impact rideshare customers?
Yeah, well, in some ways we dodged a bullet because the city has a 72-cent tax that I think is proportionately reasonable for people. That it brings in some revenue for the city, but it doesn't sort of penalize the sector. The state was looking at a $1 tax on all rideshare trips, despite the type of trip. A lot of us argue that trip should be scaled on what kind of service you're using. If you're using Uber Pool where you're sharing a ride, if you're using Lyft Shared or Via, that tax should be less because you're in effect carpooling. So I think when the city looks at this, Uber, Lyft, and Via will want to see a tax that applies to everybody, but also encourages people to pool if they can.
You mentioned some of the other factors that show that we're all driving a lot more with gas being down and other factors. How much of the responsibility does ride sharing bear?
It's a real difficult question because we don't exactly know what people would do were it not for ride sharing. We do know that transit is down for lots of reasons. Well, transit is flat. I shouldn't say it's down. Bus ridership has been down. We think work from home is a big factor. We know that there's a lot of substitution to some of the active transportation modes, and ride share is a piece of that, but we think of a relatively small piece. But as you look at downtown and just the scale of activity with ride share, these congestion fees have some benefit for that as well.
And we're almost out of time, but political will, do you think it's there to impose a fee like this?
Well, it's fascinating because I've been around Chicago forever, and this downtown versus the neighborhood debate just goes from generation to generation. So here's actually a tax that's scaled to downtown, where people using it will mostly be higher income with maybe some exemptions. Out-of-towners, downtown people will bear some of the costs for all the new development that's occurring. So I think politically the mayor could sell this, but we see what happened with the red light cameras. You go a little bit too far and the public pushes back.
More to come. Joe Sweeterman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, prospects for the sale of legalized marijuana in one Illinois city.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
The Naperville City Council is just saying no to the sale of recreational marijuana once it's legal statewide in January, at least temporarily until voters are able to weigh in. Those in support of opting out believe having dispensaries could lead to increased crime and be harmful to young people, while those who are in favor of marijuana sales in town believe it's a way to increase revenue. Here to tell us more about the decision are two members of the Naperville City Council, Judith Broadhead and Kevin Coyne. Welcome both of you to Chicago Tonight.
Thank you.
So Judith Broadhead, let's start with you. Walk us through, if you will, what happened at the City Council meeting this week.
This week we had, I believe, 235 plus speakers who were very interested in the issue of whether or not we would opt in or opt out, to put it very simply. So it got a little complicated toward the end of the meeting, and but the newspaper articles about it are a little bit unclear. People have spent some time trying to sort that out. But what happened was we decided to opt out until a referendum. And everybody on the dais agreed that there should be a referendum. This was an idea a few of our new younger council members came up with within the last week or so. That had not been something considered before. Really, the only controversy about it is when that referendum will be. It has to be a non-binding referendum because legally there are only certain kinds of referenda that can be binding. So there's going to be some disagreement about when that should be, and then of course council members can decide if they follow the advice of the referendum or not, and they are free to do either one.
Okay, and I want to come back to that referendum later on, but Kevin Coyne, first of all, you were there, so
I was there.
This is what happened as well.
Night.
And the vote was, we know it was 6-3, and just because, as you mentioned, Judith, there was a bit of confusion, a bit of nuance. If you were among the 6, what were you voting for? And if you were among the 3, what were you voting for?
Well, I think there was a lot of concern locally, not just amongst the speakers, but amongst our local medical community and law enforcement, that if we were to opt in, you have an increase in the stores in town, which leads to an increase in marijuana sales and usage. And with that increased usage of marijuana, you have a host of different concerns being raised, from car accidents to truancy and delinquencies in schools, use of harder drugs. So we were concerned that if we were to opt in, that we expand those negatives locally in our community. And I think that's why we were concerned and wanted to opt out.
Judith Broadhead, so you already have in Naperville a medical dispensary. What's the experience been like with that?
The experience has been just fine, and actually this is probably something I would not have necessarily thought we should opt into a few years ago, but we've had an excellent experience with them. Most people in town don't even know where it is. It is in a sort of business industrial park. There have been no significant incidents whatsoever, and I was in favor of opt-in, although I'm willing to go along with a referendum. I was among the 3 that voted no because I would like the referendum to definitely be sooner rather than later. March 2020 is the first possible time. But for instance, we have had no uptick in things connected to our dispensary for medical marijuana, and I don't anticipate that we would have anything like that if our fine police department and our strict enforcement of 21 and up for the other substances we allow to be sold, like alcohol and cigarettes, is also enforced.
Kevin Coyne, what's been your impression of having the medical dispensary there?
We haven't had many issues with the medical dispensary, but I don't think the medical usage is what's driving some of the concern on the opt-out side, or even adult usage. What's concerned to me and many of the folks that have been concerned about bringing in the stores is the expanded use amongst our young people. And I think the professionals in this arena, drug counselors and again law enforcement, would echo the concern that if the stores come, there's an increased chance that you're going to have increased usage amongst those young people. I'm not concerned so much about medical usage at all. My concern is on a recreational level that we have our young people testing themselves out on marijuana and other drugs.
Could residents not just go to a nearby community that does have legalized recreational marijuana that opted in for it?
Clearly they could, but a couple things to that. One, Naperville's a great city, great reputation. I'm not excited at all about putting our city's name and stamping an approval on the usage of marijuana, and I feel that's what we'd be doing. And then beyond that, we've all spent a lot of time researching this issue. It, to me, is without question that when cities have these stores in their town, the overall usage clearly goes up. And so, yes, you could go to another city, but that doesn't mean we have to endorse it, and it doesn't mean that we have to expand the usage within our town.
So I have a different point of view on this, and I'm an academic. I've been a professor at North Central for 30 years. I'm in English and in Chicago area studies, but I have colleagues who do research in drug addiction and who teach about drug addiction, and the advice they have given me and the meta research, if you look at it overall, does not point to additional usage among teenagers, anybody under 21, when a state legalizes cannabis. There are some studies that show it ticking up a little bit, some that show it in another state ticking down a little bit, but overall there is not a change.
Then what do you see as the benefits to having it recreational marijuana in Naperville?
Sure. Well, certainly there are tax benefits. They would be substantial. They would probably be hundreds of thousands of dollars of tax revenue. They certainly could be. So, I mean, that is one of the reasons that cities would opt in. And the cities around us, we are both cooperative and competitive. So we know, for instance, Downers Grove seems to be on the path to opting in. Bolingbrook has opted out. Wheaton has opted out. There will be others who will address it, because every town has to make some kind of a decision or have a plan in place by January 1st. The other thing is that I think when people discuss who goes to the medical marijuana facility, they notice it is extremely well run, ID is required, and it is, I don't think we would see anything that would resemble some of the way sales occur in some of the western states, for instance. And I think it would remain a safe, or it would become a safe, comfortable place for Naperville residents to go if they choose to use this substance, which will be legal as of January 1st.
Do you see benefits aside from tax revenue? In addition to the tax revenue?
Well, it would be, again, just as I said, it would be a place, I think Naperville would do it right, and I think we would enforce the rules very strictly about where they could be located and what the hours would be, and there's a whole list of things that a municipality can regulate, and I think we would probably do a better job than some other communities might.
Kevin Coyne, what are the next steps towards having that referendum on the ballot for voters?
Our council is going to have a tough decision and probably another debate as to when we're going to have the referenda heard. And well, really three chances: the primary election in 20, the general in 20, or the next consolidated election in April 21. So that's probably the next step that we'll be undertaking, is what makes sense for our voters and when should it be heard, and it'll likely be one of those three elections.
And we're almost out of time, but if voters should say we do support it and we do want it here, what does that mean for the council?
I will be happy to support what a referendum comes out with, and I think I have said if it's very close, 49-51, I might consider what that should be? Would that
I need to go. But
The point of the referendum is to get the mandate of the people, find out what the will of the people is, and I think most of us would be inclined to honor the vote once it's heard.
Okay, Judith Broadhead and Kevin Coyne, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chicago's Mount Rushmore. That's one nickname train-goers have given the floating heads seen from Chicago's Green Line. Founded by the Floating Museum, its latest public art initiative, Cultural Transit Assembly, is working to activate public spaces seen from the city's Green Line.
An interpretation of Chicago's founders has been floating across the city in an effort to connect communities from Austin to Inglewood with the help of the Green Line.
Often cities have this downtown central core where most of the cultural capital lives, and we're really invested in thinking about a horizontal structure where we really value the work being done in the neighborhoods to really celebrate the whole city.
You think of the city as the museum and the neighborhoods as the galleries.
The interpretation of Chicago's founders is a part of Chicago Floating Museum's latest public art initiative, the Cultural Transit Assembly.
Now, the founders sit at two of Chicago's biggest intersections, the train and the park.
Each week, the four founders pop up in parks adjacent to the Austin to Inglewood Green Line. The L train has custom artwork commemorating two of the founders, Chicago's first non-Indigenous settler, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, and his wife, Kitihawa. The other two faces are Chicago's first black mayor, Harold Washington, and a young boy representative of the future.
As we talked more and more about Jean-Baptiste du Sable, we began to notice, although there isn't much about him, there's even less about his Potawatomi wife, Kitihawa, who, without marrying, he would not have been able to trade and be a part of the Potawatomi tribe, which was really that union that allowed trade to happen and sustain and grow. So once again, we're just in trying to acknowledge people's roles and contributions to the development of Chicago, we need to acknowledge everybody.
They invited Indigenous people of Chicago to be a part of the installation, including Monica Richter-Bolter, who is half Potawatomi and half black.
I'd like to think that I kind of resemble something of what DuSable and Kitihawa's kids would look like.
But because there were no photos of DuSable or his wife to go by, the Floating Museum's founders say their use of interpretation and imagery is one of the installation's biggest takeaways.
Ultimately, all the work we do is about a dialogue. It's not a solution, it's not a perfect depiction. It's really about getting people asking questions or pushing against in a lot of ways.
Chicago Green Line trains will feature performers leading up to their Expo Chicago at Navy Pier, where the founders will be on display. The creators of the Floating Museum say they have to take advantage of the train's platform for riders to see Chicago's Mount Rushmore.
On the train track, gallery cars activated with arts and culture so that they're passing, these moments of passing. So an adjacent park could be one of our exhibitions, but you could literally jump on the train for $2.50 and have a sort of museum experience.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
The founders will be floating around the city until September 11th. It'll pop up again at Expo Chicago at Navy Pier from September 19th through the 22nd. In the meantime, head to our website for a first look at the Floating Museum's next CTA installation ahead of its official unveiling next week. And now to Paris Schutz and a new podcast about military-civilian relations. Paris.
Thank you for your service. Those are the words commonly uttered to active and veteran members of the armed forces. Our next guests are graduate students at the University of Chicago who have trained for the military, and they say they're fascinated by hearing that phrase over and over. So much so that they started a podcast called Thank You for Your Service, which they hope will help civilians better understand the military. And co-host Thomas Krasnation and Nick Perezzo join us now. Welcome, both of you, to Chicago Tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so Thomas Krasnation, why did you want to start this podcast?
We came to the University of Chicago straight from the Naval Academy, so from a very military background. We came after reading a lot about the civil-military gap in American society. There's an article in 2015 in The Atlantic by James Fallows on this topic about the widening divide between America and its military and some of the problematic policy implications that might have. And so as military students coming to a civilian institution, we thought that would be a good place to start some of these conversations, to help our civilian counterparts, our fellow civilian policy students learn more about the military, and also as members of the military, just try to engage in some of those conversations.
All right, so Nick Thomas talking about the civilian-military divide. What is it that the civilian world perhaps gets wrong about the military or doesn't quite understand?
So when we talk about the civil-military divide, it's that less than 1% of the American population serves in the armed forces. And so it's that 1% protecting the 99%. And when you have that gap, that can have some serious implications. I think, for example, we think that when veterans return home, they're often plagued with mental illness and post-traumatic stress. And that's not always true. Being a veteran is just part of a past life. It's an experience, one of many experiences that they have. And they have a lot to contribute to society.
So it's a misperception about veterans. And so we mentioned at the top, thank you for your service. You get that a lot, and you're kind of interested to explore why people keep saying that to service members. Why, what did you find?
Well, one of the things that we've experienced a lot, even when we were students at the academy, was this idea that even though we're just in training, we haven't actually even served or deployed or done many of the things that so many veterans have done, yet we still get that, the thank you for your service mentality. And what a lot of the time it seems like is that civilians who say that, it's hard to get more of a conversation going with them beyond just the thank you for your service. And so through this podcast, we really hoped to give our civilian counterparts more to talk about with members of the military than just the greeting or the phrase, thank you for your service. If we meet someone who's one of our civilian classmates and we find out that they come from a certain job background or a certain policy area, we want to know. We're interested in what they care about and what they're interested in. And we wanted to open those same kind of conversations with military people.
And it always comes from a very sincere and genuine, authentic place. I think it's great that civilians do thank veterans for their service, but it also seems to be a conversation ender sometimes. And how can we get beyond just a thank you for your service, or actually sharing those experiences and talking about what we've been through, both on the civilian side and the military side?
So perhaps people are trying to sort of tell you they appreciate you, but they don't really want to learn, what the military is like so much. You also talk about, there's a common theme in some of your podcasts about deference to the military. Is the United States too deferential to the military, meaning we just trust what the military does without being skeptical?
We did have some guests, some scholars who made that case. They believe that constitutionally, civilians are supposed to control the military, have oversight over the military, yet because of this high regard with which the military is held in the United States, there's too many civilians who are willing to just let the military make decisions that civilian voters themselves should have some stake in, like whether or not to go to war.
And you've had a lot of high-profile guests on talking about this. General Stanley McChrystal, former Senator Claire McCaskill, CNN, Washington correspondent Jake Tapper. What was the process like getting these people to come on your podcast?
It was really just a matter of reaching out over email. And
there's David Axelrod there, who's the head of the Institute of Politics there.
Yes. So the Institute of Politics was a really great resource to reach out to these people. Many of them, General McChrystal, Senator McCaskill, came through the Institute of Politics, and so that's how we were able to introduce ourselves to them, was through that avenue. But other guests, it was a matter of emailing them and reaching out like that.
One of your guests was Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Presidents Bush and Obama. Let's hear a little clip of his interview on your podcast.
We have a habit in any institution, it was true in the Navy, it's true in the military, of sort of talking to ourselves. I had an opportunity because of that position, because we were at war, because there were so many wounded and families who were losing their loved ones, to talk to the country. And I wanted to do it in a way to audiences that didn't know much about us. We're less than 1%, we're half of 1% of the population of the country. Americans didn't know who we were. And hardly, they knew we were at war, but that was about it. And because we're such a small percentage, Americans hadn't bought into the wars. So I wanted to have that conversation with them, and I chose as many venues as I could.
So you hear Mike Mullen there. Did you find a sense of all these guests that they want to bridge the civilian-military divide? They really want civilians to understand what military life is like?
Yes, and going back to your previous question about how did we get some of these guests, they were all very eager to participate, because even though at the time when we started out, we were a very small podcast and not very many listeners, they still, whichever audience was willing to listen to these conversations, they wanted to help bridge that gap.
We mentioned the misperception that people have about veterans, that they're all struggling with PTSD, they're all broken, but as with any population, there's a range of people. What about misperceptions about active duty members? I mean, some people might think they're all conservative, they're all pro-war. What are the common misperceptions you see?
I think you hit the nail right on the head that the officer corps is extremely Republican, and while some sections of it do lean right, it's definitely not true for all people in the military. So that's just one of many misperceptions that goes on. I think another one is that, you know, all veterans or all service members are actively participating in war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that's not the case. You know, service members participate in so many different activities in the military, from playing in military bands to going to civilian institutions and making podcasts.
Sure, like you guys. And so what are your plans? You're in school right now, you're getting a master's degree at the U of C, but then you're going back into active service. So tell me about your plans after this.
That's right. After I'm done at the University of Chicago, I'll go to Charleston to start nuclear power school, and I'll be a submarine officer.
And how about you, Nick?
I'll be reporting to a destroyer that's stationed out of Mayport, Florida right now.
So you think you're going to continue podcasting while you're doing this, while you're deployed?
It might be a little hard, but we'll see.
Finally, what is the number one thing you want listeners to get out of this?
We really just want people who view the military as this isolated and insular and intimidating institution to gain a foothold by which they can start to learn more about the military. We don't think that some people are going to listen to this podcast and that's it. That's all that they ever need to know about the military. It's the entirety of their education. We just hope that we can get people interested and give people a few resources that they can use to learn about this institution, which is a big part of our society.
And I've listened to a few of the episodes today, and I've learned a lot. Thomas Krasnation, Nicholas Parezo, thank you both very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paris.
Again, the podcast is called Thank You for Your Service. You can find a link to its episodes on our website. And now, Brandis, back to you.
Thanks, Paris. A Chicago company is dedicated to preserving artworks and heirlooms from around the world. We recently visited the nation's largest private conservation lab for a look at how they are rejuvenating an artful piece of Chinese history. Here's Jay Shefsky with another look.
Birds sculpted from stone. Bamboo leaves carved from jade. Scenes of China etched in rosewood. These are all facets of an imperial screen given to Emperor Qianlong in the 18th century. Its 10 panels are being meticulously cleaned and preserved to rejuvenate the screen to its former glory.
Sometimes things come in and you say, this is a moment in time that is very special. That piece has been slowly deteriorating since 1791, and of course it was in this incredible museum, but it had a lot of issues.
The screen came from the Lazadro Museum of Lapidary Art. The museum, dedicated to the art of cutting and polishing stone, recently vacated its longtime home in Elmhurst. It will reopen in a larger space in Oak Brook in the fall. When we visited the Conservation Center, this museum treasure had been dismantled, and a team of furniture conservators was midway through a multi-layered treatment.
Right from the get-go, the craftsmanship was excellent, obviously. It was just kind of like you could look at it and go, wow, this is really as good as it gets. I think in terms of Chinese screens, I've worked on a lot of them over the years, but this is definitely the best.
They estimate the project will take more than 600 hours to complete.
It's a big project. There's lots of steps to it. It needs a lot of work. So we have been just working away step by step, just stabilizing, cleaning, replacing areas of loss.
The center's laboratory in Westtown was a collaboration between Studio Gang architects and the conservators themselves.
We have 44 experts trained from all around the world, covering pretty much every art discipline, whether it's furniture or textiles or photography, works of art on paper, gilded artifacts, frames. And it's really, a business like this is all about the talent of the people that are here. And things come in from all over the country. whether it's a family heirloom like a book or a letter from a family member, or it could be a major work of art from a museum or a corporation or an institution. I've been here 30 years now, and that is probably one of the best parts of working here, is because every day it's different. You know, you see something come in and someone's telling you the story of why this is important to them and why they cherish it and why they want to have it preserved. And then they sort of hand it over to us as the caretakers, and it goes through this incredible process.
And there is a lot of science involved in the process. An art conservator is accredited and generally has more education than an art restorer. Conservation requires more scientific expertise than restoration. Some jobs are more challenging than others, but a conservator's philosophy could be summed up as less is more.
We're trying to bring a piece back to as close to original condition as we can, but preserving its age, its history, bringing it back to where it should be. So it should look like a piece that's been looked after for 200 years, as opposed to look like it's brand new.
You don't want to be aggressive or invasive. You want to use techniques that are 100% reversible, and you want to really honor not only the intent of the artist and the process of the artist, but also the character and life that it's gone through over the last, whether it's a decade or centuries.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Jay Shefsky.
Conservation work on the Imperial Chinese screen is expected to wrap up by the end of the month. It'll be reinstalled at the Lazadro Museum of Lapidary Art in October. You can find out more about the Conservation Center and the museum on our website. And that's our show for this Thursday night. Please join us tomorrow night at 7 for the Weekend Review. We leave you tonight with more of the Floating Museum's founders, as well as a look at their next CTA installation, visible from the Garfield Park Conservatory stop. Head over to our website for a breakdown with two of the museum's other founders. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.